Hi, everyone. This is Jason Burack of Wall Street for Main Street. Welcome back to another Wall Street for Main Street podcast interview. Today's special guest is a first-time guest. He has a PhD in economics from Russia. He is a professor of economics at Carthage College. He successfully defected from the Soviet Union, where he now lives in the US. And I've watched many of his YouTube lectures from the Mises Institute YouTube channel, where he is a senior fellow at the Mises Institute. Yuri Maltsev, thank you for joining me.
Well, thank you for having me.
Now, Yuri, I want to get into your expertise here about all the craziness that's happening with fights along race, class, gender, age, ideology, and how it seems like it's a Soviet playbook. But first, I want to get your thoughts on the economic damage of this lockdown and the global pandemic, because it seems the economic problems are what's leading into the social problems. So how much economic damage do you think has been done so far? I've seen some estimates where it's at least $8 trillion from the Congressional Budget Office. Do you think it's a lot more than that?
Well, to tell you the truth, it's very difficult to even make an assessment. I think our GDP is dropping like 30 or 40%, and that's because the whole economy was a standstill. And now I hope we will facing recovery. But from another hand, if you can look at the left, and now they're beating the drum again of the second wave, and that we shouldn't liberalize, we shouldn't open the economy again and keep people at home getting angry and getting hungry. And that's, I think I agree with you about it.
Yeah, one thing about the Austrian School of Economics, Yuri, I'm sure you're aware of this, but maybe our listeners who are not as familiar with the Austrian School of Economics is you have Friedrich Bastiat, who is before the Austrians, and then Henry Hazlitt talking about the seen and the unseen. So there's stuff that we can see, the economic damage with restaurants closing, bars closing, bricks and mortar retailers getting looted, small businesses being burned to the ground in Minneapolis and so many other places. But then there's the unseen. So people who are depressed, people whose savings are being tapped or who don't have savings.
Exactly. Yes. And it's I just can share with you that I knew rather well Sergei Khrushchev, who was the son of the Soviet dictator Nikita Khrushchev, and he was 84, and he was teaching at the Brown University, and in Providence, and he just committed a suicide a week ago. Can you imagine that? I mean, that's obviously for me that was, and he did that because he couldn't handle it anymore. And right now, a lot of other people, maybe they don't go to this extreme, but a lot of other people are getting angry. There's a lot of, looks like a lot of, at least where I live in Illinois, a lot of problems of domestic abuse, domestic violence, things like that. So depression, a lot of other deaths, which are not a COVID, not the coronavirus deaths, but deaths because of heart attacks, of the strokes. So really, it's a very difficult time.
Yeah, I totally agree. The level of alcoholism has also spiked.
Yeah, I just read that the nationwide, the increase in alcohol sales were like from 300 to 500%. So maybe it's a good time to buy the stock of the distilleries and wineries.
Yeah, and there's a lot of moral decay and moral bankruptcy. People are doing things, well, they're going to regret them in the years to come, but they're doing them to survive now, to earn money online.
Right.
So I want to ask you about the Soviet Union's playbook to collapse the US from the inside out. So I think this is well documented. There's been a lot of experts talking about this in the past, like KGB defector Yuri Bezmenov and others, where the goal of the Soviet Union was to collapse the US from the inside out rather than a nuclear war or attacking the US, but was to create, I guess, a civil war and infighting among race, class, gender, age, and ideology. Do you think what's happening now is the old Soviet playbook coming back to life?
Yes, I think that it definitely plays a very, very, very important role because there's no Soviet Union anymore, so they collapsed by themselves. But what I'm thinking of that they completely, and not only them, it's our own intellectuals did the same. They completely poisoned our public education. poisoned higher education especially, poisoned our culture. If you will look at the Hollywood movies and whatnot, every second one, if not everyone, is very much anti-American, anti-culture. And I'm not surprised by this outbreak of violence, an outbreak of fighting with history, of erasing history according to Stalin's playbook. Stalin's playbook was that the first thing you need to erase history. So people would become ruthless. People would become without the past. And people would live in today's only. And in today's, you need, according to Marx, you need to have an oppressor and oppressed. And that was a slave and slave owner in ancient Greece and Rome. I'm just quoting from Capital. And then that would be a feudal, and that would be a lord and serfs, and proletarian and capitalist. That means workers and capitalists. And so all the time, his point was that the history of the world is the history of struggle. And if you'll apply that to the United States, well, we don't have these proletarians. I mean, it's difficult to say even who are proletarians now and who is really oppressed. And so then, I think, and then Barack Obama before and many other intellectuals in the United States, they were making the point that we should create, to change society, we should create some kind of like a majority of minorities. And that's why the focus of the ruling class right now is on creating tensions and division between people based on all kind of real or imaginary differences. And I would say most of the differences are really imaginary, like skin pigmentation or sexuality or social position. So these are the issues which are so familiar, because that was exactly what the Reds did in Russia. And the people like that, how they ruined 35 countries, applying the same kind of agenda or the same kind of a blueprint to countries as different as East Germany and Cuba, as Somalia and Soviet Union, as Poland and Vietnam.
Yeah, I think the main oppressor is the Federal Reserve and big government, because look at the economic disparity. Look at the wealth disparity now that the Federal Reserve has created. How many more billionaires just in the last 4 months have been created with the currency and credit that the central banks have flooded the system with? And the average person, the man on the street on Main Street who's listening to this podcast, is only got maybe a $1,200 check. Maybe their small business didn't even get an SBA loan. And all these the Federal Reserve now is going to start buying individual corporate bonds. So people are getting upset, but I think the blame is being placed on capitalism, and the blame is being placed inaccurately at the wrong groups.
Of course, it's not capitalism which should be blamed, but the lack of capitalism. I agree with you completely. It's all dead wrong. It's kind of, I remember when I came to the United States, it was a World Marxist Conference in Amherst, Massachusetts, a very proper place for that. And they were discussing what is capitalism and how could socialism fail. And they had a resolution at the end of this conference saying that what actually killed the Soviet Union was capitalism. It was state capitalism. So capitalism killed the Soviet Union, and that's kind of that's the most insane kind of thing. And the same thing going right now, that capitalism kills everything, which is, again, tells you that the true agenda and the true goal of these revolutionaries today is to get rid of our system, to get rid of the United States as we know it, and to get rid of our economic system.
Yeah, some of the leaders of these protest groups have admitted that they're trained Marxists for decades now.
That's right, exactly. Yeah, especially Antifa. If you will look at that, Antifa was very well known in the Soviet Union, because Antifa was founded in Germany in 1932 by Ernst Thälmann. Ernst Thälmann was an NKVD or KGB, in other words, agent in Germany. And he was sent there by Stalin to start this Antifa. And Antifa was, well, in German it's called Antifaschisten, Aktion. But what kind of fascists they were fighting? They were not fighting real fascists. They were fighting so-called social fascists, social democrats. That was Stalin's definition of fascism, that fascism is social fascism. And so this is the same kind of ideas that they have today. I mean, they're attacking all kind of monuments without any, I would say, discrimination against who these monuments are to. They're making the strange points that this whole civil war was not actually, we didn't have it, that instead of civil war, they're saying that slaves freed slaves. So this is, they want to impose on us the same regime of public slavery, which was actually true socialism. Socialism is nothing but public slavery, when everybody is owned by the state, by the government.
And everyone's made more poor. I think that's the thing that most people don't understand, because these younger college kids, and you teach at a university, so I'm sure you could speak about this better than I do about the effect of socialism at universities, but these kids are not hearing about any of the negative consequences of socialism from their professor. They're convinced that socialism hasn't been done the right way, that there's no negative connotations to socialism, that there's not a lot of violence, and that it can be done better and more peacefully. But you know, the truth is the exact opposite.
Exactly, and it is exactly opposite, because I mean, we have right now this tragedy south of our border, Venezuela unraveling, the country which was the most prosperous country in Latin America. And then there were two most prosperous countries. One was Cuba, which was destroyed from 1959 and on, and another was Venezuela, which survived until 1980s. And so this is ridiculous that we have a sad saying in Russia that the only real lesson of history is that it does not teach us anything.
Everything has gotten so absurd. It seems like the George Orwell quote from 1984, where, quote, every record has been destroyed or falsified. Every record has been destroyed or falsified, every book rewritten, every picture has been reprinted, every statue and street building has been renamed, every date has been altered, and the process is continuing day by day and minute by minute. History has stopped. Nothing exists except an endless present in which the party is always right. It seems that's the path we're on, and every day a new statue or people are calling for canceling someone on social media or trying to ruin them financially.
Exactly. Yes, completely agree with you. And that's why Orwell was on the hit list of the KGB. Nobody could read it.
But this starts with Karl Marx, right, with canceling history. So Orwell was just, in better words, talking about what Marx wanted?
Well, he depicted it. I don't think he agreed with what that he was quoting, but that's exactly Marxist playbook, Marxist-Leninist playbook. That amazingly now that under Stalin, most of Russian history was unavailable. People couldn't know it. The whole history was the history of crimes of capitalists or other oppressors against the people. And Stalin abandoned it only in 1942 when he legalized religion. For what reason? Because during the war, which started a year before in 1941, up to 1942, there was already 2 million defections from the Soviet army to Germans. So he was afraid that the whole armies would just defect from the Soviet Union. And that's why he kind of gave this so-called opening for people, which was again a trick to trick people into something. But yes, most people in the United States do not realize how bad it was. Even how bad it was when I lived there, it was very bad again. I mean, if you will look at consumer goods were non-existent, or you need to stand for hours and hours and hours in line to get shoes. And when you approach the this counter where they sell the shoes from, and I would say, do you have the size 10? And they would say, no, who cares about the size? Take what we have. And really, people would buy shoes for the very wrong size just because they would then barter them to other shoes or sell them with a profit on the black market or do something else, because almost everything was better than to have this worthless money. And that's, you mentioned Federal Reserve, and that's, I think, why we need to keep a very keen eye on what's happening with our money supply.
Yeah, I actually wanted to ask you about the black market because it was thriving in the Soviet Union, but what did people actually use to buy things on the black market with? So what currency? Was it barter? How did they get anything to buy anything on the black market if the Soviet currency wasn't trusted?
It wasn't trusted, but still it was very fiercely imposed as a kind of as a legal tender by the government. You could lose your life. They shot a lot of people. I'm not making it up. They shot a lot of people for currency transactions. In 1961, there were like about 10 people who were sentenced to from 10 to 15 years of imprisonment for running some kind of like an underground exchange bureau, just exchanging Soviet money into hard currency. And so they were sentenced to that. Nikita Khrushchev, during breakfast, he read the article about that in Pravda, and he immediately called the Attorney General of the Soviet Union, saying, what is this liberalism about? Kill them all. And can you imagine the people who, for something which is not even a crime in a free society, these people were dragged, and they were pretty much upset getting 10 to 15 years in dreadful Soviet prisons, but they were dragged out of their cells and then shot in the prison yard right away. So you could see that definitely black market was very dangerous. And because of that, prices on the black market were so high that very few people could afford it. But over there, at least it tells us how the markets, how the kind of they're natural for people. And so they still survived during this time of anti-market wars.
In your speeches for the Mises Institute, you've talked about how difficult it was to get books in the Soviet Union by FA Hayek, and how you were committing a crime. What type of crime were you looking at just for getting the book and reading the book? Well,
if you read a book which was published by something called samizdat, that means underground publishing, because there were some people who were on the side of liberty so much that they risked their lives and their well-being and well-being of their families, and they were translating books, and they were typing these books on mechanical typewriters through the carbon paper. So there was some underground publishing, and so people had some access, but the hit list of KGB, which would include books by Hayek, by Solzhenitsyn, by Orwell, and many, many others, hundreds of people, if not more. And so that if you read something from that hit list, if you're lucky to get it, then, and if you'd be caught doing that, you could get 7 years of prison, of Soviet prison. And being in Soviet prison, it's the end of your career, it's the end of everything. You wouldn't be able to find a good job, or you could maybe become a handyman or something at best, or at worst, you would become a manual worker, digging trenches, digging canals, and doing something else, or building roads. In the United States, people who are building roads are very well paid. But there, you would be in the same position as the people who built Egyptian pyramids under pharaohs. They would just be on the wage which cannot sustain.
It's basically slave labor, right?
Yes, that's the slave labor. Exactly. Yes. So 7 years. But if you are the one who gave the book, and then you can get 15 years of prison, because you would be already would be accused of disseminating anti-Soviet slander, and that's another article in the penal code, and that's 15 years, which in most cases would mean death.
Wow.
Not many people would survive that.
I mean, most people can't even fathom what you just described. And yes, people are not being thrown in prison for that yet, but it's starting to get pretty bad here, Yuri. We have book banning now on Amazon for the last few years, a bunch of different books, especially on libertarian and conservative side, and other and other issues are being banned for really no reason whatsoever. And then we have these big technology companies, these social media companies they're just targeting people that are conservative, pro-Trump, libertarian, and they're just deciding, even though that they make their money online and built up a social media presence to make money online, they're just wiping them away, like Stefan Molyneux. Did you see what happened to Stefan Molyneux in the last couple of days?
Yes, I would say that that's exactly, again, this is another Marxist kind of playbook, that you should at first control what people can get access to. I talked to a couple of days ago to a good friend of mine from United Kingdom, and he told me that there is the complete attack on Rudyard Kipling and Herbert Wells. I don't know why Wells was a friend of Lenin, but now there is a campaign to remove their books from libraries. And that already smacks like Nazi Germany.
Yeah, this is the digital equivalent, I guess, of book burning.
Right, exactly. This is, well, the good thing, we have internet at least, that you can read, you can have an access to whatever you like, but that's I'm afraid it's not forever.
What do you think are steps that Americans can take to stop the stuff that's going on right now?
I believe that the only kind of, at least what I see, is that to use what we can, and that would be voting, to vote all the bums out, and to vote the people who are both indecent and socialists, and they are just. And we know there is a party which is called by kind of, it's a misnomer, calling it's Democratic Party. It's a party of slavery, of Ku Klux Klan, which turned right now into Communist Party. That is to get rid of these people. That's, I think, the most important. Ludwig von Mises in 1956, I think, he wrote a short essay called "Are We Historians of Decline?" Are we historians? Is it decline? It is decline, definitely. But von Mises, the message of this essay was that no matter what it is, decline or not, we need to fight. Because we need to fight for our freedom, because the enemies of liberty would destroy civilization, and because socialism is not a civilized society. I love his famous quip that the difference between capitalism and socialism is not the difference as between different systems. It is the same difference as you have a glass of potassium cyanide, or the glass of milk. It's not the difference between beverages, it's the difference between life and death. And that's exactly, the socialism is death, public slavery, and then death.
You brought up voting. I think that's a short-term solution. I think the long-term solution is education. So we need to educate people about the Federal Reserve Bank, what it really does, about voting for big government, about corruption, about the size of government, and how it's pervasive. And then maybe people will decide, they're learning the hard way, right now, a lot of people who have voted Democrat for years in many of these cities, like Chicago, Minneapolis, New York City, they're learning the hard way that the police are not there to defend their property or their businesses.
Right, but I'm afraid, to tell the truth, I'm afraid that the Friends of Liberty are losing this cultural war. Because if you will again look that the system of education, both primary, secondary, and higher education, right now became anti-capitalist in its basis. So the kids from almost day one in school are taught something which just isn't so. And then it goes on to higher education, and then which is kind of producing a lot of revolutionaries. And that's what we have already, I'm afraid. Then if you look at the mass media is just not mass media, it's kind of a mass propaganda machine, which is again very much anti-capitalist, against freedom, against everything that people cherish, against family, against whatever, it's against property rights. Then if you will look at Hollywood or so-called high culture, it's not high culture, it's high kind of propaganda. You cannot even watch detective stories. I love to watch some kind of detective movies and whatnot, but just watch this all Knives Out. And again, it's anti-capitalist propaganda disguised as some kind of like Agatha Christie type of detective story.
Were there a lot of bailouts in the Soviet Union? Are you noticing even more similarities now between the US economy and the Soviet Union then?
Well, economy-wise, no, because economy-wise, we still are blessed by what we have left of the free market. And so because of that, we don't experience long lines. We don't need to buy anything on the black market. And so that's but in the Soviet Union, according to Soviet sociologists, as I remember when I was there, they calculate that in your lifetime, about 6 years, you are standing in line to get something. If you would, some people would spend the whole working day. That's one of the reasons that productivity was so low, because there were no incentives. Why they would kill people? In Soviet Union alone, they murdered anywhere from 43 to 61 million people. 43 million was even admitted by the KGB chairman, Mr. Khrushchev. And 61 million, it's a kind of, it's the American demographer, Rudolf Rummel, and actually Solzhenitsyn Foundation. So I don't care whether it's 43 or 61 million, both numbers are completely over my head, because that's the amount of evil is just amazing. Most people in the United States, they never heard of it. And if they would hear, they wouldn't understand. They would say, it's Stalin, he was paranoid or crazy or something. No, it happened because socialism does not have any incentives to do anything. And the only way to make people to do what the great dictator wants them to do is to threaten them and kill them, kill many of them, just to teach the others. And that's why, say, under Stalin, they created a system of random murders, when people would be killed randomly. People who would hate Stalin or who would adore Stalin, who were members of the Communist Party and who were not members of the Communist Party, people who were Russian or Jews or Kazakhs. And if you kill people randomly, then everybody began to tremble with fear.
Oh, so it was a control mechanism then, because it was so random that everyone was meant to be scared.
Yes, because if you don't know how you can modify your behavior to stay alive, then nobody is safe. Nobody can have even an illusion of safety. If they saw people who yesterday were heroes and today they became the worst enemies of the people. So this is this socialists, they designed these devilish schemes to rule. That's what it is. And maybe you notice that I do not use the word communism, because here in the United States, many people, many of my colleagues in academia, they would say, well, actually, communism was bad. Communism and fascism, these are bad, but socialism is good. But communism was never practiced. Communism would be a kind of a
utopia, Marxist utopia. That was the goal, right? To get to utopia.
That's right. And even Marx admitted that he thinks that communism can descend on us in 400 or 500 years. So we still have 200 years to wait. And his point was that under communism, it would be a complete paradise on earth. There'll be no government. The state would wither away. There'll be no money. Everybody would work as hard as they can. They would consume as little as they can. And that will be paradise on earth.
Yeah, in reality, none of that was true in the Soviet Union or Venezuela. And now we have, you mentioned, like, what you described sounds like 1984, Big Brother, George Orwell, but that was before the technology that we have now. Now we have mass surveillance in China. They have unbelievable amounts of cameras. I think hundreds of millions of surveillance cameras all over China with facial recognition software and audio recording. Their social credit score system in China, which may be coming here to the US, where if you do something that you buy something or do something that the government doesn't like, they can fine you, or worse, maybe even shut down your credit card or bank account.
That's probably right. Yeah, but again, I would think that that the major threat to our freedoms, to our lifestyle, is enemy within. I was on a panel with Ron Paul some time ago in Orlando, Florida. And somebody said, somebody asked the question that how about that, I mean, small government, how about our enemies overseas? They can just invade us. And Ron said, I think that most enemies of the United States that I know of are within 1 mile radius from my Washington office. And I believe that that's true.
Yeah, I completely agree. I live right outside of Washington, D.C. in the D.C. metro area, and there is a lot of warmongering. I've seen actually John Bolton drive around me here.
Yes, that's, I even met him when I lived in Washington. Yes, these are the people who, I agree with, with Trump. He has a wonderful tweet about Bolton. He said, he tweeted that if I would listen to Bolton, we would be in the middle of the World War VI.
Oh yeah, when the mainstream media, ABC News, was doing that exclusive interview with John Bolton, they didn't bring up his track record of war and death squads in Latin America and all the other bad things Bolton's done. None of that was brought up. It was only about making Trump look bad instead of his total record of military-industrial complex and war.
Right. Yes, that's the most, it's kind of a Trotskyism in our time, to go and bomb everybody. This neoconservatives really became very dangerous. I mean, we have, from one hand, we have this Marxist, we have the left wing of the Democratic Party, which is just should be called the Revolutionary Communist Party. And then we have on the other side, we have the so-called conservatives who want to go and bomb everybody. And that's, I mean, if you remember John McCain and Bolton and others, they just never would miss a good war.
But I don't think this welfare warfare state is sustainable. I mean, the dollar, they're going to have to create unbelievable amounts more currency units. They're talking about this MMT. Now, the department you worked in, you were one of the head economists in the Soviet Union in charge of a lot of the economic data. You were really high up there. I want to talk about the Soviet economic propaganda. How bad was the economic propaganda in the Soviet Union? I read a book about Google called In the Plex, and they were talking about Sergey Brin's dad and his family. Sergey Brin's dad and Sergey Brin defected. I think the father worked in one of the economic departments, and the father was in charge of creating new mathematical equations, garbage in, garbage out, where the end result was to show that there was no inflation in the Soviet Union and that the Soviet standard of living was higher than the US. Is that the type of economic propaganda that the Soviet Union had?
Yes, of course. I mean, that was completely unrelated to any numbers even. The numbers, it was so easy to make any kind of numbers. I remember that Laura de Andrea Tyson, she was the chief economist for Bill Clinton. And Professor Tyson, she wrote a book, and it was, I think, published in 1986, which was her doctoral dissertation. And it said, the title was Comparative Economies of Eastern Europe, in which she claimed that Romanian economy of Romania, Ceausescu Romania, was the best because they were showing economic growth of 12 to 15% every year. And at that time, I was also working with something called Council of Mutual Economic Development. That's a kind of a socialist central plan for all these other countries. And we called it Council for Mutual Economic Destruction. And I remember we had this gentleman from Romania, and his name was Iona Draculescu, and so everybody called him Dracula. And he was kind of a nice guy. He would smell alcohol at 9 o'clock in the morning already. And so when I saw him in the corridor, I said, "How do you fake statistics?" And look, American economists are looking through your so-called statistics and saying that you are doing better than everybody else. How do you fake it? And he said, "Yuri," he said, "we never fake statistics." I said, "Well, come on, you're a friend." He said, "We make statistics." And I said, "What's the difference?" He said, "To fake statistics, you need some statistics, then you fake it. But if you're making statistics, you're just making it from scratch." And I said, without primary reporting. And so I said, "How do you come up with these numbers?" He said, "You just stare on the ceiling, and then you see the numbers there in red and black, mostly black. You take them down, you go to your boss," he would correct it. And I said, "Well, I'm looking at the ceiling right now, and I don't see any numbers there." He said, "Well, have a drink. And and if that's not enough, have another drink. And then you'll see numbers all over the place." And that's what was Soviet economic statistics. Moreover, even working for the Gorbachev's government, we had three different types of economic statistics. One was public. It was just pure propaganda, that it would tell us that the Soviet people are doing better than anybody else, and it was completely unrelated to reality. Then it was the second tier, was kind of a classified statistics, presumably for people who are managing this economy. And it was also false. It was also false. And the idea was that it will leak and people would see, well, we are not as good as in the statistics number one, but we are still doing very well. And the third one was already secret. For leaking that, you could go to prison for the end of your days. And that one was also some kind of more open, and then you could see that the country is going down the drain. But the statistical methodology was so wrong that I would say that all three layers of statistics were dead wrong. And speaking about the Brin, the elder, and I knew Nikolai Fedorenko. Nikolai Fedorenko was the chief mathematical economist in the Soviet Union at that time, and he was the director of the Institute for Economic Modeling. And he, in one of our meetings, he said that to get a real 5-year plan, you need about 30 million, that's he calculated, 30 million of computing years. So in 30 million computing years, you can then make a balanced 5-year plan. I think that he was wrong in that even because you can have millions and millions of these computing years and it still would be the same thing. That's what von Mises was writing in his first great essay was Economic Calculations in the Socialist Commonwealth, in which he made the point that it is impossible to calculate anything in a rational way if you don't have markets. How do you come up with prices?
Even with prices, I don't think the economy can be modeled accurately. But Yuri, it seems that all these governments to a different degree, now I think China is probably doing even more economic propaganda than some other countries, but all these governments, more to different degrees, are doing economic propaganda at this point. They're lying about the real inflation rate. They're lying about the unemployment rate. They're lying about GDP. I don't even think GDP is that accurate because it counts government spending and investment as the same thing.
Well, the GDP, the whole GDP statistics, which actually was at first the so-called national accounting, was developed by Simon Kuznets, another Russian economist in the United States, and later he got Nobel Prize for doing that. And he himself, I mean, if you will look at the first edition of his national accounting book, he himself admitted that the national accounting is pretty bad and faulty. The only thing we need to have is just to have some kind of something which we didn't have, and that was 1930, that was Great Depression. So his point was that it's better than nothing. I don't know if it's better than nothing or nothing is better than it, but yes, the GDP accounting is definitely in many cases flawed. Then speaking about China, I was in China last summer, just exactly a year ago. And I was, to tell the truth, I was impressed because I knew some Chinese economists. I went to Mongolia, also into South Korea, and talked to many people. But in China, they have an interesting kind of society. They have capitalism for many people, and some are still in socialism. And it looks like, at least that's what I heard from the people I know in China. And these are people who also read von Mises and Hayek. And their point is that the Chinese government, they have kind of like a social contract. So if you are not very much against the government, if you are not visible as anti-government activists, then they let you live your life. And I would say I was pretty much impressed by the fact, because I was in China 20 years ago, it was a different country, completely different country. Right now, if you would go to Shanghai, you would see that architecture is mostly Chicago style, and some parts are just stunningly beautiful. And it's very clean and whatnot, and friendly people. So I would say that's not China, China which is socialist. That's why they achieved that. But because they abandoned the socialism for a majority of people, so they have a thriving, I think, middle class. You see a lot of nice cars, a lot of nice dressed people, and people are very friendly, and that's exactly the opposite. Say 20 years ago, people would try to avoid any contact with you, eye contact or any kind of human contact, because they thought you are kind of they would just look at you like you are a rattlesnake.
They don't trust. You mean don't trust foreigners?
Yeah, that's right. And now today it is, and that's, I think, is again an illustration to von Mises' thesis that property rights are changing people, changing culture, changing everything. And if you remove property rights, and that's what's happening in the United States in many cases, then what is happening? Then people are losing culture. They become pretty upset with everything because, say, in Soviet Union, I don't remember that anyone ever smiled. Nobody would ever on the street, if you don't know a person, to smile to somebody. No, they would think that this is kind of the first symptom of craziness.
Yeah, there's a lot of people here in the US now, Yuri, with no income, no job, and no assets. And a lot of it is because of the coronavirus lockdown, although it was getting bad before that. But really, this has gotten things so much worse in just the last 4.5 months.
Well, right, yes. But coronavirus, it's just, my sister, she's immunologist and epidemiologist in the University of Chicago. And so I'm from medical family. And I would say that the only excuse for all this is complete, that we didn't know anything. And even today she's saying that the only thing she knows for sure that she doesn't know anything about this virus. And people were scared royally. And what comes to mind is a great quip, also from Hayek. And his point was that if you want to increase greatly the power of big government and deprive people of their individual liberties, you need a crisis. And this crisis can be real, imaginary, or fabricated. I think that this coronavirus crisis is all three of them.
And what do the politicians like to say? Never let a good crisis go to waste.
That's right. That's right. And look, I mean, right now, they kind of, I was watching yesterday Mr. Schumer, and he had kind of like even a foam coming out of his mouth. That's how he was so much upset that the people were ending lockdowns, that the governments in the southern states were ending lockdowns, and on and on like that. So definitely, I think that under the brave new world, where the Democrats promise us, we would all be sitting at home until they would let us out. And yes, that's very, very sad. And that's the country is really divided, and that reminds me again of Reds and Whites in Russia in 1917, in Russian Civil War.
Well, Yuri, we've had a really great conversation today. There's a lot of insights there about economic propaganda and what happened in the Soviet Union. Thank you so much. Hopefully it doesn't get that bad here in the US, but unfortunately, I think I see things are going to get worse before they get better. I really don't like what the big technology companies are doing, because they are trying to financially ruin people in the process, and then the digital equivalent of what Amazon's doing with book burning. But I want to thank you so much for your time today.
Yes, well, thank you, Jason, for having me. And I want to end with another very, I would say, a kind of very Russian saying that optimist is an ill-informed pessimist.
So then I assume then you're buying gold and silver or Bitcoin.
All right. Well, send me something about it.
Well, if you don't trust the system, you vote with your currency, right?
Yeah, if you don't, you vote with your currency or you vote with your feet and going somewhere else. But I'm not sure that there is something else that we can defect again, and I'm too old to defect again.
Yeah, I agree. I want to try to improve things here in the US. And I think this starts with financial education. So the Mises Institute, what you're doing over there, the great speeches, and all the other great people like Jeff Dice, who I interviewed recently at the Mises Institute, providing a quality financial education that people are not getting in government schools, not getting at universities, unfortunately not getting from their parents either for free, is just, you're doing amazing work. It's amazing charity.
Well, thank you very much. But I think that what we should keep in mind, that financial education and every other types of education in culture, in history, in social science, they're all interconnected. There is financial education is on one, it's one of the sides of this coin of being educated, because many people who would be maybe educated in something else and would be financially ignorant, they will still be a prey for the big government and cheating money-wise, because our wealth is denominated in money. So that means that if government is undermining the money, they're undermining our property. And this is very important for us to keep in mind.
Amen. Thank you so much for your time today. I look forward to speaking again in the future.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jason.